Welcome to the Sober Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Brickhouse. And today's topic is the causal relationship between drinking and drugging and suicide. Since it's National Suicide Prevention Month, we have a special sober celebrity guest, Clancy Martin. He is a Guggenheim Fellow, author of many books on philosophy, acclaimed novelist, recovering alcoholic, and the survivor of more than 10 suicide attempts. His latest book that brings him to us today is How Not to Kill Yourself, a portrait of the suicidal mind, which Alexandra Jacobs in the New York Times calls, quote, a doozy, messy, confessional, but ultimately beneficent, casting a harsh, high beam on a growing societal problem, swaddled in mental health resources and caveats. It doesn't so much illuminate as irradiate. So we do have a trigger warning in case you're sensitive to self-harm or suicide. So to all of our listeners that may be triggered, please tune out. And also, if you are having thoughts of suicide, call or text 988 to reach the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or go to speakingofsuicide.com/resources for a list of additional resources. Thank you for joining us on the Sober Podcast, Clancy, and welcome to the show.
All right, it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. And I have been devouring your book, which speaks to me as an SAS, Suicide Attempt Survivor is my acronym or my lingo for that, my classification for that. And I'm, of course, and I'm also a recovering alcoholic. So thank you for writing it. I think you're going to help a lot of people.
Well, certainly, I hope so. I think that the best way for us to help people, both with struggling with addiction and struggling with suicidal thoughts, is to do exactly the kind of work you're doing. That is, let people know that we're out there, where there's nothing mysterious about it. It's not nearly as rare as people think, and you're doing a real service by reducing stigma and taboo and letting people know that ordinary people have these struggles.
Great. Well, your book is doing a lot of service because, you talk about suicide behavior, thoughts, ideation from of course, from your own personal experience, but through the experience of other writers and from a philosophical standpoint and from the standpoint of an alcoholic in recovery, which is what I really want to talk about today. And you write in How Not to Kill Yourself, quote, heavy drinkers and drug users are much more likely to kill themselves than people who don't have chronic substance abuse problems. Statistics that always startles me is that, this is you speaking, that about 25% of all chronic alcohol and drug users kill themselves. Alcohol is involved in about a third of the suicides in the United States, and more than half of all suicides are committed by people with substance abuse problems. And then you continue, or later on you write, for me, alcohol turns the volume knob of suicidal thinking from a 2 or 3 to a 10, end quote. And I totally relate to that. Of your more than 10 suicide attempts, how many were done while you were drunk or after drinking?
It's a good question. I would say more than half. So it's a little difficult for me to give an exact account of my suicide attempts, other than like more than 10 is a sort of an optimistic way of putting it, I suppose. And it depends how you count a suicide attempt. I've spent day upon day after day, and it's one time in my life when every morning, part of my morning ritual was what some would count as an attempt. That is just going into the bathroom and putting a gun in my mouth and trying my hardest. And that went on for months. So depending upon how you count. But of the times that I've wound up in the hospital, all except for I think 1 or 2 have involved alcohol.
Yeah.
usually alcohol and drugs. So I think that the times that I've managed to get myself close enough to death that a doctor was intervening pretty consistently, alcohol, sometimes with drugs, sometimes without. I'm not much of a drug person other than alcohol, but usually this is some kind of medication prescribed by a psychiatrist that I was using to try to abet the alcohol in the suicide attempt. Yeah, pretty consistently, and or as you say, couple of times, the hangover the next day was what precipitated the attempt.
Right, right. And what for me, because I know you have, as you know, many attempts that didn't involve alcohol, and for me, they always involved alcohol. The two times, I was both drunk both of the times, and certainly the second time I was drinking had a lot of alcohol in my system from excessive drinking on a daily basis. And so for me, I feel like the depression and the suicidal ideation was brought on by the alcohol. Alcohol, as many people know, is a depressant, but many people forget that. And I'm wondering, for you, how much do you think that brought on your depression and or exacerbated maybe depression that you might have already been suffering from?
Absolutely. Guaranteed it exacerbated the depression. And I think that, speaking as someone who's been in recovery, sort of actively in recovery since January 1st, 2009, following a suicide attempt, I would say to other addicts out there that if you are thinking that a relapse might be coming, if you're thinking of falling off the wagon, get your house ready. In other words, don't make sure there are no lethal instruments in the house if you possibly can. Anything that you think you might use to kill yourself, get that out of your house, because almost
so safety proof your house from yourself.
Safety proof your house from yourself, because almost guaranteed, if you're going to fall off the wagon and you have any tendency towards suicidality at all, chances are this is when you're going to make an attempt. And this is not just on the basis of my own experience, but this is on the basis of the experience of countless cases, both people I know, psychiatric cases I've read about, and then, unfortunately, cases when people have died by suicide. So it's the case that alcohol, for many people who struggle with depression, particularly when they were young, depression and anxiety was a reliable drug for them, and it helped them.
Right.
And then but unfortunately, as we recovering alcoholics know, your brain, something happens in the wiring, and you believe that it's going to continue to be a treatment for those problems long after it stops being a treatment and actually starts being a part of the cause of those problems.
Right.
Say exacerbates.
It turns on you.
Yeah, it turns on you. And so I think that people in recovery should really have to be extra careful about this question of the way that their brains may turn on them when they're in a weak and vulnerable state.
Well said. And despite the facts and statistics which I cited, that you cite in your book, and I cited earlier, and they're out there, the public discussion about suicide often minimizes or ignores the glaringly significant role of alcohol and drugs in depression and suicidal ideation. And even in interviews and reviews around your book, a lot of time there's very little mention or no mention of your alcoholism or that you're in recovery when you could devote a significant amount of that to your book. In the section which I love called drinking, what was it? How to kill my no drinking myself to death or
Yeah, drinking myself to death. Yeah.
yeah. And in the relapse chapter, those chapters, are amazing in the way that you deal with your alcoholism, your recovery, the AA world, and your suicidal behavior. But often, like, and when I'm talking about like usually in the press, in the way the media covers it, especially if there's a celebrity suicide, and they often minimize or ignore the role of alcohol and or drugs. And do you think it's because they romanticize suicide, meaning they're more invested in the dramatic idea that a person's suicidal depression to end it all was caused by a dramatic calamitous event, rather than also looking at the other underlying causes?
I'm sorry to say that I think that is exactly the reason, that unfortunately there is still this, well, for me, romanticization and stigmatization always tend to go hand in hand. When we make something taboo, at the very same time we increase a kind of dark allure that it has. And we have the opposite thing happens when we give a real honest account of what something is like. Then we domesticate it, we make it both less frightening and less alluring and less tempting. And I think an awful lot of the time in the media, unfortunately, they are still both, on the one hand, glamorizing the suicide, the act of suicide, and at the same time relying on the stigma and relying on the taboo, and ignoring the crucial role of drugs and alcohol in so many of these stories. As you say, accomplishes both of those goals at the same time, basically. And this is what unfortunately creates what's called the Werther effect, after Goethe's novel The Sorrows of Young Werther, where suicide rates increase, sometimes alarmingly so, after a famous person dies by suicide. And then when those kinds of accounts are given in the media. Whereas, by contrast, there's another effect just as well documented called the Papageno effect. And the Papageno effect is after the character in Mozart's The Magic Flute, is that if you give a rich account, the kind of account you're giving, for example, when you talk about how drugs were a part of a person's life leading up to the suicide, alcohol was involved leading up to the suicide, depression, anxiety, you really tell the story, suicide rates actually go down. So this is why, and this is simply statistically true, and the media can save lives if they tell the stories properly. And so this is why I was saying to you before we got on how grateful I am to you for for telling your own story about having attempted and failed and attempted suicide and survived.
Yeah.
Because this
and
will
like you, my second suicide attempt was also then that finally got me or led me to long-term recovery eventually.
Well, wonderful. And this is telling the story like that will actually you will actually save lives. We know statistically, simply by telling that story in this podcast. There will be people who hear the story who are thinking of taking their own lives, and they won't do it because they'll think, you know what, Jamie tried and he didn't die and he's still around and now he's sober, and that will inspire them rather than having the opposite effect.
Yes, well, thank you. And I think they're going to be saying the same thing about Clancy. Is it time for a commercial break? You know what? It is. And that's a great place for us to break. And we will be back in just a few seconds. So stick with us, everybody.
Hi, I'm Sonia, the founder of Everbloom. We help you change your relationship with alcohol through connection and conversation. We provide small group meetings where you can share your story and get the encouragement and support you need to achieve your goals. Whatever your goals are, we're a judgment-free space. You can find us at joineverbloom.com, BLUME, and try us out with a free meeting.
And we are back talking to Clancy Martin. He is the author of How Not to Kill Yourself. And Clancy, we're talking about the role of alcohol in your suicide attempts, but you also had several suicide attempts that did not involve drinking. Tell us how they were different and what was going on in some of those with you at the time.
Sure. I think for me, the difference between the attempts when alcohol was involved as opposed to the attempts when it wasn't is something about the ease of making the attempt, really. Getting up to an attempt when I was sober was always a much more torturous and painful affair, psychologically speaking. It was, usually slower, more days of brooding over the attempt in a more increasingly concrete way, and sometimes would become a habitual pattern of a certain style of attempt over and over. Whereas when alcohol was involved, the suicidal thinking was there, but then it would increase dramatically because I had alcohol in my system. And then, the familiar kind of, the hell with it feeling that one gets after consuming a certain amount of alcohol. You're sort of like, you know what, the hell with it. It reduces our inhibition, as is widely known and documented, and as any consumer of alcohol will tell you. And
I don't need to show up for work in the morning. I don't need to keep my clothes on. I don't need to stay alive.
Yeah, I don't need to not call this person.
Right.
I don't need to stay alive. Exactly. And so, yeah, so for me, in a way, a suicide attempt while drunk was a little bit like an extreme version of a drunk dial, and there's usually a little drunk dialing that went on before,
right,
before I was in the tub with my, I don't want to go into all the details, but so it made it easier, much the alcohol attempts were ones which were much easier, I would say, and they tended to be in a way more more akin to the kinds of attempts that you expect, sort of the easy sorts of attempts that one makes in one's home, I suppose. Yeah, I can't stress enough for the listeners who have perhaps someone in their life who's struggling with suicidal ideation and also has a codependency of, I think that the structure of suicidal thinking and the structure of addictive thinking are, if not identical, extremely similar. They're very parallel. We get into these habitual patterns that are motivated by deep feelings, for many of us, deep feelings of self-loathing, need to escape oneself, need to escape the smell of oneself, not just the need to escape one's life, but the need to escape oneself. And
but that's what I would like you to talk a little bit more about, because I think would be important to so many of our listeners who, like, for instance, I don't think that I have suicidal thoughts. They never get very far. And I don't think from my experience so far, I I wouldn't try to attempt suicide unless I was drunk again. That's my story. And that kind of depression that brings me that low is brought on by excessive drinking.
Right.
You, however, have had suicidal thoughts and behavior for much of your life, and you're also an alcoholic in recovery, and you've had that's played a big part in your suicidal behavior. But unlike me, and unlike probably you're one of those where it exists without the alcohol and booze. And so I would love to hear more about that. Not just attempts, but the thinking, which you write so beautifully about in your book.
Yeah, well, I think that the thinking is, if you think about the style of thinking that made you. Now I'm talking to people who suffer from one or another kind of addiction to drugs or alcohol. If you think about the kind of thinking that kept you going as an addict after you realized that you had a problem, the self-doubt, the anxiety, the misery, the real sort of, as I say, need to escape oneself. This is the exact same kind of thinking that for people who suffer from chronic suicidal ideation. Even, I have lots of friends, people that I am helping or trying to help, who suffer from chronic suicidal ideation, and they don't drink or take drugs, and yet they still report these same kinds of feelings that I hear from people that I've sponsored in AA, or from other people I've tried to help who are dealing with addictions to substances.
Yeah,
they are these feelings of trying to make either themselves go away or make the world go away, or both. Escapist kinds of feelings, and obliteration. Exactly. Yeah. How can I make the world go away for a while, or make me go away for a while, or both? And the extreme form of that, the most extreme form of obliteration that any of us can think of is suicide. And unfortunately, it's the case that in my own experience, for an awful lot of people I know, when you first get sober, that year or two, when you don't have your old drug that did help you obliterate yourself, you may find that suicidal thinking becomes particularly burdensome. Yeah. That was certainly the case in my own experience. And William Styron wrote about this so beautifully. He never really was suicidal while he was a drinker. It was when he could no longer drink, and he didn't quit voluntarily. He quit because his body just suddenly refused to take alcohol anymore. I almost felt like he got so lucky. His body just wouldn't let him drink.
He was literally allergic to it. Right?
Yeah, he was literally allergic.
Finally allergic to it.
Yeah, he physically could not take it. Like, if only that would happen to me. But the depression that fell upon him then, because he could no longer consume alcohol, was the worst of his life. And, and then he attempted suicide trying to escape that depression. And I think the same thing probably happened to David Foster Wallace, and to a lot. It is not uncommon for people to make a suicide attempt in their first couple of years of sobriety. And I think the reason is obvious, is that just you used to have this way. Even if in some ways it amplified the pain, it also in some ways is medication for the pain that you suffer. And then you don't have that anymore. And these psychiatric drugs they're giving you maybe aren't helping at all. Maybe they're even making matters worse. That was my own experience. And then you're finally like, okay, I can't take it. Just the mental pain is too much. I can't bear it. And we get into these spirals of self-loathing where we slowly become convinced that we'd actually be doing the people we love a favor by annihilating ourselves, rather than,
causing them pain.
Yeah, exactly. Usually the one thing that can keep you going, even when you're really, really down, is like, okay, my children need me, my loved ones need me. but your thinking can get so distorted that you actually believe that you're a source of unhappiness and misery to those people, and they'd be better off without you. And yeah, so in those cases, what I always tell people is it's very much like with any other kind of recovery. The one thing that is guaranteed the best possible medicine is reaching out to someone who you trust, you know.
Mhm.
Um,
Connection. And I think you talked about when you were talking about AA specifically, and you were saying they had that term, it's put principles before personalities. And I think you wrote that, the principles, don't so much connect with, it's the personalities that really make it for you, and the connection.
yeah, it's true. I mean, the last 6 months or so of my life have been the first 6 months really, where it's been easy for me not to feel suicidal. And it's like a miracle. I never expected it. And at the same time, it's also been the last 6 months or so very, some of the most carefree months of my life. And, I want to knock on wood with both of these things. But on the question of alcohol, and I think a big part of the reason for that is just I've been making so many connections with so many people through this book, who are similar, who are suffering in a similar ways. And it somehow liberates you from the feelings that drive you to those dark places.
Absolutely. I love your advice to someone considering suicide, and it's mine too. When I've given a few talks about suicide, and this was my advice too, and it's a riff on AA's advice when considering a drink, which is wait until tomorrow. You can always drink tomorrow, and the idea being, of course, that tomorrow won't come. And I've heard of many in long-term sobriety who become so hopeless, and using or drinking not being an option, that they consider suicide, like you were saying earlier. So what advice would you give them? That would be the connection, right?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, you know, um, I've always, when it comes to the question, I always had this sort of reverence for these old timers. You would hear them talk sometime and they go up, and people who had truly lost everything. They'd lost their careers, they'd lost all their loved ones, none of their family members were talking to them anymore. Like really lost everything. And they were sober, and they're up there talking about being sober. And I was just thought, how the hell, how do they do it? Because I have to rely on everyone around me to
Yeah.
stay sober and to stay alive. My children, my wife, my community, all these different people. And then I realized, that's why they're up there talking, is for that connection, and that is what's keeping them sober, and that is what is making their life meaningful. The fact that they can share their experience with these other people, and these other people, they can see these other people need them and are benefiting from them. So that human connection, that like the fact that we're all suffering, but it makes it a lot easier if we're suffering together and we're trying to take care of each other. That is a kind of, priceless wisdom that you see repeated over and over and over by every great mind through the history of civilization, but it can never be emphasized enough. Just that simple human connection is life-saving stuff.
Absolutely. And you talk about how you see your addiction to suicidal thinking and addiction to alcohol as operating the same way. And but talk about how you feel like you've lost the desire to drink and suicidal thinking in some way, and how those go hand in hand.
Yeah, it's strange. These two things, I never expected I'd gotten long past the point where I thought my thinking about wanting a drink was ever going to change, or my thinking about wanting to kill myself was ever going to change. And it was then that mysteriously they started to change, long after I'd given up the hope that they would change. And I think that's non-trivial, because I think part of the problem was, part of what was informing my addiction to alcohol and to suicidal thinking was trying to push it away, trying to get rid of the thought, trying to fight the thought of a drink, trying to fight the thought of suicide. And it took me a long time, because I'm not a very smart guy and I'm a real slow learner. I mean, anybody who's tried to kill himself more than 10 times and still has not managed to do it, is not the brightest bulb in the chandelier.
But you're intelligent in other areas,
One can only be so lucky. But I think it was when I finally allowed myself to say, okay, I'm just going to always want that drink. Okay, I'm always going to want to kill myself, that the acceptance of those thoughts could finally start to take place, and they could be less fearsome. And in being less fearsome, they sort of lost their traction. They started to let me out of their jaws a little bit, and
they lost their power over you.
Yeah, they lost their power over me. It's like that South tribe from somewhere in the South Pacific, who they spend a lot of time teaching their children about how to improve their dreams. And they say, one of the things, when you're having a scary dream, you turn and you face the monster that's scaring you in the fairy dream, and in the scary dream, and then the monster. I think like finally being willing to just not run away from the monster or try to push the monster away, but just saying, yeah, hey, there you are. There's the monster. I don't expect you to go anywhere. And suddenly the monster is sort of like, well, you're boring now. I'm gonna move on to something.
Right. I can't scare you, so
yeah, I can't do anything. I can't work with you. Come on, give me something to work with.
What I know you write about being in going to meetings in AA, or what keeps you from drinking today?
I think mostly what keeps me from drinking today is very simple things. I have a whole host of habits that I follow. I have to get regular exercise. I have to get a reasonable amount of sunshine. I have to get a reasonable amount of work. I have to get a good night's sleep. Simple things that I've learned, that I need to do in order to kind of maintain a healthy state of mind. And then I need to, if I'm going to be in a situation where I know, okay, this is where you're going to be vulnerable, like alone in an airport for a long period of time, something like that,
Yeah.
I need to go into that situation prepared. Like, okay, you're probably going to be tempted by, if there's a really alluring looking wine bar in the airport, probably it's going to say something like, hey, come have one glass.
Just one.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Just one, just for the taste. But I think that
And do you still do meetings? Is that
all of the meetings that I attend are when someone who is in recovery says to me, hey, would you mind coming to a meeting? Then I go. But
yeah.
I don't go as a matter of course anymore. I help a variety of people who get in touch with me who need help. And then I always encourage them to go to meetings. And then if there's some way I can be of further help, other than just staying in touch, I do. But no, I don't regularly go to meetings anymore. I enthusiastically endorse things like your podcast and, AJ Delario's newsletter, The Small Bow, is great. And things like this, I think are wonderful and they help me. But, for me, what helped more than anything was taking responsibility for what I call sort of my spiritual nutrition, and just recognizing that I had to pay as careful and meticulous attention to the diet of my mind as I do to the diet of my children, or
Oh, I love
to,
that. The diet of your mind. That's good.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And that is really what does it for me. Really, really just taking care of that, that spiritual or psychological nutrition.
Right. One last question, and you may have already answered it in many different ways. So, but I'll ask you to pick your favorite child kind of thing. What's the best lesson you've learned in recovery, and how did it help you?
The best lesson that I've learned in recovery is that you don't need to be afraid of your own thoughts. Whatever the thought is, let yourself have that thought. Let yourself take care of it. Don't, no matter how frightening or loathsome or unpleasant it is, don't try to chase it away. Just you could even hold that thought like a baby and say, okay, I'm going to take care of you. You're welcome to stay for as long as you like. It's going to pass away like all your other thoughts. They come and they go. They are no thought and no feeling is forever. It's going to come and it's going to go.
Right.
But I think that's the single best lesson that I have learned, that even no matter how angry you are, no matter how certain you are that something is the right thing to do, or you have to do this now, particularly when it comes to suicidal thinking or any kind of violent attack on yourself, which includes alcohol in my case, and drugs for other people. Let yourself think about it as much as you want. You don't want to get attached to it. Don't keep reinforcing it, but let it be there and be willing to let it go as it goes, and it will go, but baby it a little, baby yourself a little.
That's a great lesson, is not to be afraid of your thoughts. Hold them, take care of them. And a great way to end today's interview. And to all of our listeners, be sure to get a copy of How Not to Kill Yourself, A Portrait of the Suicidal Mind, by our guest today, Clancy Martin. It's an important read, but it's also more than that. It's a very entertaining and informative read. And I'm in the middle of it, and I'll probably finish it tonight. So thanks again, Clancy, for being on the show.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie, for doing the show and for having me on. And yeah, I hope you laugh. The old saying, in the AA rooms, we all hear each other laughing. And
yes, you can hear me laughing reading this book, because it's very serious. There's a lot of humor in there.
I hope so.
Thank you for your continued support. To our listeners, visit us on soberpodcast.com and all places where you find major podcasts to leave us a review and sign up for our mailing list. You will also find the contact information in the show notes for our guest, Clancy Martin, and more info about how to get his book. I am your host, Jamie Brickhouse. You can find me on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook, where I tell a true story in high heels every day. Signing out from the Sober Podcast. Tune in for another show next week. And one more word, if you are having thoughts of suicide, call or text 988 to reach the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or go to speakingofsuicide.com/resources for a list of additional resources. And tune in for a new show next week.